The strangest thing about kindness, Lily Brooks would later say, is that you never realize it's about to change your life. The wind that morning cut through Manhattan like a blade of winter glass, sharp and relentless, rattling the metal poles of the bus stop on 7th Avenue while the gray sky pressed low over the city. Snow had started falling again, the soft, stubborn kind that coated sidewalks and muffled the sound of traffic, turning the usual rush of New York into something quieter, almost distant. Lily Brooks hurried down the block with her coat pulled tight around her shoulders, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She checked the time on her phone again. 8:42 a.m. Her job interview was at 9, 10 blocks away, and every minute felt like a step closer to losing the opportunity she had spent 3 weeks hoping for. The folder clutched under her arm held everything she owned professionally: 2 printed resumes, a certificate from a community college program, and a handwritten list of talking points she had practiced in the mirror the night before. This interview mattered more than anything else right now. Rent for her tiny basement studio in Brooklyn was already 5 days late, and the landlord had made it very clear that patience was not part of the lease agreement. Lily walked faster, boots crunching against the thin layer of snow beginning to collect along the curb. The city around her moved in its usual rhythm, taxis sliding through slush, coffee carts steaming on corners, commuters rushing past without looking at one another. But Lily kept her eyes on the sidewalk ahead, counting blocks, calculating minutes, promising herself she wouldn't miss this chance. Then she saw him. At first he was just another shape in the winter haze, a man sitting on the edge of a bench beside the closed entrance of a subway stairwell. His coat looked thin for the weather, dark wool dusted with snowflakes. His posture slumped forward as if the cold had settled directly into his bones. People passed him without slowing. A delivery cyclist swerved around him. A woman with a briefcase glanced once and kept walking. Lily nearly did the same. Her phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. Interview, 9 a.m. She took 2 more steps before something in her chest tightened, the quiet voice of instinct that refuses to be ignored. She turned back. Up close, the man looked pale from the cold, dark hair damp with melting snow, one hand resting against the metal railing beside him as if steadying himself. His eyes lifted slowly when Lily approached, surprised more than anything else. "Hey," she said softly, crouching beside the bench. "Are you okay?" The man hesitated before answering, his voice calm but tired. "I'll be fine." But Lily could see the way his hands trembled slightly in the freezing air, and the way he kept glancing down the empty street as if unsure where to go next. She glanced at the time again. 8:46 a.m. 14 minutes. If she kept walking now, she could still make it. The logical part of her mind said exactly that. But logic didn't seem to matter much when someone in front of you looked like they needed help. Lily exhaled slowly, kneeling fully in the snow beside the bench. "You don't look fine," she said gently. "And it's 28 degrees out here. You shouldn't be sitting in this weather." The man studied her with quiet curiosity, as if trying to understand why she had stopped when everyone else hadn't. For a moment neither of them spoke, snow drifting steadily around them, the city rushing past without noticing that something small but important had just begun to change. The cold seemed to settle deeper into the morning as Lily Brooks brushed the snow from her gloves and looked at the man again, realizing that whatever had brought him here had left him stranded in more ways than one. "Did you lose your phone?" she asked carefully. The man shook his head once. "The battery died about an hour ago." His voice was steady but distant, like someone who had spent the last several hours thinking too much and moving too little. Lily glanced down the street, watching a bus roar past in a cloud of gray slush. Her bus, the one that would have taken her 3 blocks closer to the office building where her interview was waiting. The digital clock on the bank across the street blinked. 8:49 a.m. 11 minutes left. Lily felt the familiar squeeze of anxiety rise in her chest. Every instinct told her to stand up, apologize politely, and hurry toward the opportunity she had been chasing for weeks. But something about the man's expression stopped her again. He did not look desperate or dangerous. He looked lost in the quiet way people sometimes did when life shifted suddenly beneath their feet. Lily stood and pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers slightly numb from the cold. "There is a diner about 2 blocks down," she said, glancing back at him. "They open early and the coffee is good. You should warm up." The man hesitated. I do not think I can make it that far right now. Lily studied him for a moment, then made a decision she knew might cost her the interview. She stepped to the curb and raised her hand as a yellow cab rolled slowly through the snow. The taxi stopped beside them with a splash of slush against the curb. The driver leaned out the window, his breath fogging the air. Where to? Lily turned to the man. Where do you need to go? He seemed surprised by the question, as if no one had asked him that in a long time. After a pause, he gave the name of a nearby medical clinic. Lily nodded and opened the back door. The man moved carefully, gripping the edge of the seat before settling inside. For a second, Lily stood there, looking at the worn leather interior of the cab and the faint snowflakes melting on the glass. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the folded $20 bill she had planned to use for lunch after the interview. She passed it through the window to the driver. This should get him there, she said. The driver nodded. Lily stepped back onto the sidewalk as the cab door closed with a soft thud. Inside the car, the man looked at her through the glass, his expression thoughtful, almost puzzled. You did not have to do that, he said through the cracked window. Lily smiled in a tired but sincere way. Maybe not, she replied, stepping away from the curb as the cab engine idled. But sometimes people just need a little help getting where they are going. The driver pulled away a moment later, the taxi disappearing slowly into the snowy traffic of Manhattan. Lily watched it go until the yellow shape vanished behind a line of cars. Only then did she remember the time. 8:55 a.m. Her interview was now 5 minutes away and nearly 10 blocks. Down the avenue. She exhaled slowly, clutching her resumed folder to her chest as the wind pushed fresh snow across the street. For a moment, she stood there wondering if she had just made the most foolish decision of her life. Then she turned and began to run. The wind pushed harder as Lily Brooks ran down the avenue, her boots slipping slightly against the thin layer of snow that had begun turning into gray slush beneath the morning traffic. Her lungs burned from the cold air and from the effort of weaving through the steady stream of commuters rushing toward their own destinations. The tall glass buildings around her reflected the pale winter sky, while the sound of horns and distant sirens echoed between the streets. Lily tightened her grip on the folder under her arm and pushed forward, her mind repeating the same hopeful thought over and over again. Maybe they would still see her. Maybe if she explained what had happened, they would understand. She turned the corner onto Madison Avenue and spotted the building immediately. A polished tower of steel and glass rising 30 stories above the street, its lobby glowing with warm light that looked almost welcoming compared to the bitter cold outside. Lily checked the time again as she hurried toward the revolving doors. 9:03. Her stomach tightened. 3 minutes late. It was not terrible, she told herself. Maybe the interviewer was running behind schedule. Maybe there were other candidates still waiting. She stepped inside the lobby, instantly surrounded by the quiet warmth of marble floors and soft lighting. The contrast with the freezing sidewalk outside made her cheeks sting as they slowly warmed. A security guard glanced up from the front desk while Lily brushed snow from her coat and walked quickly toward the reception counter. Behind it sat a neatly dressed receptionist typing on a computer with calm, efficient movements. Lily approached, slightly out of breath, but trying to keep her voice steady. Good morning, she said politely. My name is Lily Brooks. I had a 9 o'clock interview with Mr. Henderson. The receptionist looked up at her with a professional smile and typed something into the computer. For a moment, Lily allowed herself to believe everything would still work out. Then the woman's expression changed just slightly, the kind of polite disappointment that office workers learn to deliver. Without sounding unkind, Miss Brooks, she said gently. Mr. Henderson waited for 15 minutes, but the position has already been filled this morning. The words seemed to hang in the quiet lobby for a moment before they settled into Lily's chest like cold air. Filled, Lily repeated softly, trying to process the sentence. Yes, the receptionist replied with a sympathetic tilt of her head. The hiring team decided to move forward with another candidate. I am very sorry. Lily nodded slowly, even though her thoughts felt scattered and distant. 15 minutes. That meant if she had walked away from that bench instead of calling the taxi, if she had simply kept going like everyone else on that sidewalk, she would have been here in time. The receptionist gave a small apologetic smile and returned to her keyboard while Lily stood there for another second, holding the resumed folder that suddenly felt far heavier than a stack of paper should. Outside the tall windows of the lobby, Snow continued drifting quietly across the street as people hurried past with their coats pulled tight against the winter wind. Lily finally stepped back from the desk and walked slowly toward the glass doors again. When she pushed outside, the cold air met her like a reminder of reality. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the busy city move forward as if nothing important had happened at all. Somewhere across town, a taxi was carrying a stranger toward a clinic, paid for by the last $20 she had in her pocket. Lily let out a slow breath that turned into a cloud of white in the freezing air. Well, she murmured quietly to herself, I guess that is what kindness costs sometimes. Then she turned and began walking down the snowy street with no idea that the man she had helped was already thinking about her in ways that would soon change everything. By the time Lily Brooks reached the subway entrance on the corner of Lexington Avenue, the snow had thickened into a steady curtain of white that softened the noise of the city and blurred the outlines of passing cars. She descended the concrete stairs slowly, her shoulders slightly hunched against the cold, the folder under her arm now feeling more like a reminder of failure than a promise of opportunity. The underground platform smelled faintly of damp metal and coffee from a nearby kiosk, and the rumble of an approaching train echoed through the tunnel like distant thunder. Lily stood near the yellow safety line, staring at the tracks while commuters gathered around her in quiet clusters, each person absorbed in their own morning routine. No one noticed the young woman who had just lost the chance she had been counting on to keep her life steady. When the train arrived, she stepped inside and found a seat near the window, watching the dim lights of the tunnel flicker past as the train carried her toward Brooklyn. Her reflection in the glass looked tired and thoughtful, strands of dark hair still damp from the snow. She replayed the morning in her mind again and again, the moment she had stopped beside that bench, the taxi door closing, the last $20 bill leaving her hand. Part of her wondered if she had been foolish. Another part of her quietly insisted that helping someone in trouble could never truly be a mistake. 40 minutes later, Lily climbed the stairs from the subway station near her neighborhood, the cold air greeting her again as she stepped onto the street lined with small brick apartment buildings and corner grocery stores. The snow here had already begun turning to slush under the tires of delivery trucks. She walked the final block toward her building, a narrow 3-story structure with peeling paint around the windows and a small mailbox panel beside the front door. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and laundry detergent. Lily climbed the stairs to the basement level and unlocked the door to her small studio apartment. The room was barely 300 square feet, with a single window near the ceiling that looked out at street level. A narrow bed sat against one wall, and a tiny kitchen counter occupied the opposite side. The space was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Lily placed her folder on the small table and sat down on the edge of the bed, letting out a slow breath as the events of the morning finally caught up with her. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. Lily stood and opened it to find Mr. Alvarez, the building manager, standing in the hallway with a clipboard tucked under his arm. His expression was not unkind, but it carried the firmness of someone who had already given too many extensions. Miss Brooks, he said gently, I need to remind you that the rent is now 6 days late. Lily nodded, already expecting the conversation. I know, she replied quietly. I had a job interview this morning. I was hoping it would solve the problem. Mr. Alvarez sighed and shifted his weight slightly. I understand things can be difficult, he said, but the owner expects payment by Friday. If it is not settled by then, I will have to begin the notice process. Lily thanked him softly and closed the door after he left. The apartment felt even smaller now, the silence heavier than before. She sat back down on the bed and looked at the resumed folder resting on the table, the pages inside still perfectly neat despite everything that had happened. Outside the small window near the ceiling, snow continued falling gently onto the busy Brooklyn street. Lily leaned back against the wall and stared at the ceiling for a long moment before whispering to herself, next time, maybe I should keep walking. What she did not know was that across the city, inside a quiet medical clinic office, the man she had helped that morning was already asking a very different question. Who was she? He said calmly, his eyes thoughtful as he looked toward the snowy window. And for the first time in a long while, Alexander Reed found himself more curious about a stranger than about any business deal waiting on his desk. Inside the quiet examination room of the small Manhattan clinic, the hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the distant sounds of traffic filtering through the frosted window. The man Lily Brooks had helped that morning now sat upright on the edge of a medical bed while a nurse finished checking his vitals. The warmth of the room had brought some color back to his face, though traces of the cold still lingered in his expression. "You were lucky someone brought you here when they did," the nurse said kindly as she placed the blood pressure cuff back on the tray. "Your body temperature had dropped quite a bit from sitting outside that long." The man nodded politely. "Thank you," he replied in a calm, measured voice. "I appreciate the help." The nurse gave a friendly smile before stepping out of the room, leaving him alone for the first time since the taxi had arrived. For several seconds, he simply sat there, hands folded loosely in front of him, staring at the snowy skyline visible through the narrow clinic window. His thoughts kept returning to the same moment on the sidewalk. The young woman kneeling beside the bench, her voice steady despite the cold, her expression sincere in a way that was almost unfamiliar to him. Most people in New York walked past problems without slowing down. Yet she had stopped. Not only stopped, but spent her last money making sure he reached safety. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts before the door opened again. This time it was not a nurse who entered. A tall man in a dark coat stepped inside, brushing a few snowflakes from his shoulders as he closed the door quietly behind him. "Mr. Reed," the man said respectfully, "your car is waiting downstairs." Alexander Reed lifted his eyes from the window and looked at him with quiet acknowledgement. The visitor was Daniel Carter, his longtime chief of staff, and the only person who knew exactly where he had disappeared to that morning. "You took your time finding me," Alexander said calmly. Daniel allowed a faint smile. "Your phone has been off for hours, and the board meeting is in less than 90 minutes. People were beginning to worry. Alexander leaned back slightly, thoughtful. "Someone helped me before you found me," he said. Daniel raised an eyebrow with mild curiosity. "Someone?" Alexander nodded slowly. "A young woman. She stopped when everyone else walked past." Daniel waited for more explanation, but Alexander remained silent for a moment, remembering the way snow had collected on Lily's coat as she waved down the taxi. "She paid for the ride here," he added quietly. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, surprised. "You mean she used her own money?" Alexander nodded again. "The last $20 she had." For a moment the room fell silent except for the faint sounds of the clinic hallway outside. Daniel finally asked the obvious question. "Do you know who she was?" Alexander stood and walked toward the window, looking out over the snowy city that stretched for miles in every direction. "No," he answered simply. "But I would like to." Daniel understood immediately what that meant. For most people in New York, a brief moment on a cold sidewalk would fade from memory by the end of the day. But Alexander Reed was not most people. When something captured his attention, he rarely let it go. "I will start checking the street cameras near the location," Daniel said. Alexander turned slightly, the faintest hint of determination appearing in his otherwise calm expression. "Find her," he replied. Outside the clinic, the snowfall continued drifting slowly across the city while somewhere in Brooklyn, Lily Brooks was sitting alone in her small apartment wondering how she would pay the rent by Friday, completely unaware that one of the most powerful men in Manhattan had just begun looking for her. The snow continued falling across New York long after Alexander Reed left the clinic, turning the city into a quiet landscape of white rooftops and slow-moving traffic. By the time his black sedan pulled up to the entrance of Reed Technologies Tower in Midtown Manhattan, the sidewalks had already been cleared by building staff, and the glass doors reflected the gray afternoon sky like a mirror. Alexander stepped out of the car with the calm confidence of someone used to being recognized, though today his mind was clearly somewhere else. Inside the lobby, employees moved quickly across polished marble floors while security greeted him with respectful nods. The building itself rose more than 50 stories above the city, its upper offices overlooking the Hudson River and the endless grid of Manhattan streets. Normally, Alexander would walk straight to the executive conference room, where board members were already gathering, but instead he paused beside the elevator and turned to Daniel Carter, who had followed him inside. "Any progress?" Alexander asked quietly. Daniel glanced down at the tablet in his hands. "We located the intersection where you were found this morning," he said. 3 security cameras cover the sidewalk area. We are reviewing the footage now." Alexander nodded once as the elevator door slid open. Minutes later, they stepped into the private executive floor, where glass walls and soft lighting created an atmosphere of quiet authority. Assistants moved quickly through the corridor carrying folders and coffee, while the distant murmur of executives preparing for the board meeting drifted through the air. Daniel followed Alexander into his office, where floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the snowy skyline stretching toward Brooklyn in the distance. "There is something else," Daniel added carefully. Alexander turned slightly from the window. "What is it?" Daniel tapped the screen of the tablet and rotated it so Alexander could see. The video showed the snowy sidewalk from that morning. Pedestrians hurried past until a familiar figure entered the frame. Lily Brooks. Her coat dusted with snow, her expression concerned as she knelt beside the bench where Alexander had been sitting. The footage showed her speaking with him, raising her hand to stop the taxi, and finally handing the driver the folded bill before the cab pulled away. Alexander watched the entire sequence in silence. There was nothing dramatic about the scene. No crowd. No recognition. Just a quiet act of kindness that most people would have ignored. Daniel finally spoke. "We enhanced the image enough to run a facial match through public records. It took some time because she does not appear in many databases." Alexander looked up from the screen. "And?" Daniel answered calmly. "Her name is Lily Brooks, 26 years old. She lives in Brooklyn and recently completed a business administration certificate program at a community college." Alexander absorbed the information without speaking. Daniel continued scrolling through the report. According to employment records, she was scheduled for a job interview this morning at Henderson Logistics. Alexander's expression sharpened slightly. "Scheduled?" Daniel nodded. "The interview began at 9 o'clock. She never arrived." For a brief moment, Alexander looked back at the frozen image of Lily standing beside the taxi in the falling snow. The realization was immediate and undeniable. She had missed the opportunity because she chose to help him. The office remained quiet as the winter light faded slowly across the skyline outside the window. Finally, Alexander spoke again, his voice calm but decisive. "Arrange a meeting," he said. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "With Lily Brooks?" Alexander nodded once. "Yes." Then after a short pause he added, "But not yet. I want to meet her the same way she met me, without knowing who I am." Somewhere across the East River, Lily Brooks was pulling on her coat again, preparing to leave her apartment and search for temporary work before the end of the week, completely unaware that the man whose life she had changed that morning was already planning to cross her path again. The next morning the snow had stopped, leaving New York covered in a pale winter sunlight that reflected off rooftops and sidewalks like scattered glass. In Brooklyn, Lily Brooks stepped out of her apartment building with her coat wrapped tightly around her and a small notebook tucked into her pocket. The cold air still carried the sharp bite of the storm from the day before, but the sky above the city had cleared into a quiet shade of blue. Lily walked toward the subway station with steady determination, though the tired lines beneath her eyes revealed how little sleep she had gotten the night before. Most of the evening had been spent calculating how long she could stretch the few dollars left in her bank account and how many temporary jobs she could apply for before Friday arrived. As she reached the corner coffee cart near the station entrance, the familiar smell of roasted beans drifted through the cold air. Lily hesitated for a moment before checking the small balance on her phone. $4.60. Enough for a small coffee, but not much else. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and kept walking. The subway ride into Manhattan felt quieter than usual, as if the city itself were still waking slowly after the snowstorm. When Lily stepped back onto the streets of Midtown, the sidewalks were crowded again with office workers and delivery trucks, the familiar rhythm of the city returning as if nothing had changed. She spent the next several hours moving from one storefront to another, stepping inside small businesses with polite smiles and printed resumes in her hand. A bookstore on 42nd Street had already filled its seasonal position. A cafe near Bryant Park said they might be hiring next month. A clothing boutique accepted her resume, but explained that the manager would not return until the following week. Each conversation ended the same way, with a kind apology and a promise to call if something opened up. By mid-afternoon, Lily found herself walking along a quieter side street lined with older brick buildings and small community centers. The wind had picked up again, carrying the faint smell of soup from somewhere nearby. Curious, she followed the scent to a modest building with a sign above the door that read Community Outreach Kitchen. Through the front window, she could see volunteers moving between long tables while large pots simmered on the stove. A few people stood outside waiting patiently, with cups of hot tea in their hands. Lily paused on the sidewalk, watching the activity inside for a moment before stepping through the door. The warmth of the kitchen wrapped around her instantly, along with the comforting sounds of conversation and clinking dishes. A woman behind the counter looked up and offered a welcoming smile. "Looking for lunch?" she asked kindly. Lily shook her head with a small smile of her own. "Actually, I was wondering if you needed help," she replied. "I am looking for volunteer work." The woman gestured toward a table stacked with clean aprons. "We can always use an extra pair of hands," she said. Lily slipped on an apron and joined the line of volunteers, helping ladle soup into bowls and carry trays to the waiting tables. For the first time since the previous morning, her thoughts began to quiet. There was something grounding about the simple rhythm of helping people who needed a warm meal and a place to sit. An hour later, the door opened again, letting in a brief rush of cold air from the street. Lily glanced up instinctively as a tall man stepped inside wearing a dark coat and knit cap pulled low over his hair. Snowmelt glistened on the shoulders of his jacket as he looked around the room with calm, observant eyes. Lily did not recognize him at first, but across the room, Alexander Reed had recognized her the moment he walked through the door. Alexander Reed remained near the entrance of the community kitchen for a moment, quietly observing the room before moving further inside. The warm scent of soup and fresh bread filled the air while volunteers moved calmly between the tables, offering bowls of food and cups of tea to the people who had gathered for a warm meal. It was a simple place, far removed from the polished offices and glass conference rooms where Alexander normally spent his days, yet there was something steady and honest about the atmosphere that immediately held his attention. Across the room, Lily Brooks continued ladling soup into bowls, unaware that the man she had helped the previous morning was now standing only a few steps away watching her work. Alexander noticed the way she greeted each person with the same quiet patience, offering an extra piece of bread here, a warm smile there, never rushing even though. The line of people waiting for food continued to grow. She did not look like someone trying to impress anyone. She looked like someone who believed helping mattered. After a few minutes, Alexander stepped forward and approached the counter where she was working. Lily glanced up briefly as he placed an empty tray in front of her, still not recognizing him beneath the knit cap and dark coat. "Soup?" she asked politely, reaching for a bowl. "Please," Alexander replied in a calm voice. Lily filled the bowl and slid it gently across the counter before handing him a small piece of bread. "Careful, it is hot," she said with a quick smile. Alexander nodded in appreciation and carried the tray to one of the long wooden tables. As he sat down, he allowed himself another glance toward the serving line, where Lily continued working with quiet focus. It was clear that she had not connected him with the man from the snowy sidewalk, and for the moment, he was content to let it remain that way. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the flow of visitors slowed, and the volunteers finally stepped away from the counter to take a short break. Lily wiped her hands on the apron and poured herself a small cup of water before sitting at the end of the table where Alexander was finishing his meal. She nodded politely toward him, the same casual friendliness she offered everyone who came through the door. "First time here?" she asked. Alexander looked up and gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Yes," he answered. "I heard they serve good soup." Lily laughed softly. "That depends on who you ask. I only started helping today, so if it tastes strange, you can blame me." Alexander shook his head lightly. "It was very good," he said. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence while the sounds of dishes being washed echoed faintly from the kitchen. Then Lily leaned back slightly in her chair and added with quiet honesty, "Actually, I came here looking for work, but volunteering seemed like a good place to start." Alexander studied her expression for a brief second before asking, "Looking for work is not easy right now." Lily gave a small shrug that carried more tiredness than complaint. "Let us just say this week has been complicated." She smiled faintly and looked down at her cup. "But things usually work out eventually." Alexander watched her carefully, recognizing the same calm resilience he had noticed on the snowy sidewalk. In that moment, he felt certain about something he had already begun to suspect. Lily Brooks had no idea who he was, and she clearly was not expecting anything from him. For Alexander Reed, that made the conversation far more valuable than any business meeting waiting in his calendar. The quiet moment at the end of the long table did not last long. Within a few minutes, the kitchen doors swung open again as more people stepped inside, seeking warmth from the cold afternoon outside. Volunteers returned to their stations, and the gentle rhythm of serving food resumed. Lily Brooks stood and tied her apron more securely around her waist before returning to the counter where the large metal pots continued steaming under the warm kitchen lights. Alexander Reed remained seated for another moment, watching the room with thoughtful eyes before carrying his tray back to the counter. Lily accepted it with a grateful nod. "Thank you," she said. "Most people leave the trays on the table." Alexander gave a small smile. "Old habit," he replied. Lily rinsed the bowl quickly in the sink before glancing back at him. "Are you volunteering too?" she asked. Alexander hesitated only briefly. "I thought I might help for a while," he answered. Lily gestured toward the stack of spare aprons hanging on a nearby hook. "Then you should take one of those," she said. "We could use help bringing trays to the tables." Alexander slipped on the apron and joined the other volunteers, moving carefully through the room with trays of soup and bread. The work was simple but steady, and for the next hour the kitchen filled with the quiet energy of people helping wherever they could. Lily noticed that the tall stranger worked without complaint, carrying heavy trays and refilling water pitchers with the same calm focus she had seen in very few volunteers before. At one point she glanced toward him and caught him studying the room with an expression that suggested he was taking mental notes about everything around him. It made her curious. When the final group of visitors finished eating and the tables were cleared, the volunteers gathered near the kitchen counter to wash dishes and wipe down the surfaces. The woman who managed the outreach center, Mrs. Donovan, stepped forward with a warm smile. "Thank you all for helping today," she said. "The snowstorm brought more people than usual, but you handled it beautifully." The volunteers nodded and slowly began removing their aprons. Lily was drying her hands when she noticed Alexander standing nearby, looking slightly thoughtful again. "You work hard for someone who said this was your first time here," she said casually. Alexander met her gaze. "Sometimes it is easier to understand a place by working in it," he replied. Lily tilted her head slightly, amused by the unusual answer. "That sounds like something a reporter would say." Alexander chuckled quietly. "Not exactly." Before Lily could ask another question, the door to the kitchen opened suddenly, and a young man hurried inside carrying a newspaper folded under his arm. He looked around the room before approaching Mrs. Donovan. "Did you see this?" he asked, unfolding the paper and pointing to the front page. The bold headline immediately caught the attention of several volunteers nearby. It showed a photograph of a tall man stepping out of a black sedan in front of a towering office building. The caption beneath the picture read, "Alexander Reed, CEO of Reed Technologies, named one of the most influential business leaders in America." Lily glanced at the newspaper briefly before returning to wipe the counter, not giving the article much thought. But across the room, Alexander Reed had already seen the photo and recognized exactly what was about to happen next. The young volunteer holding the newspaper stepped closer to the counter, still speaking to Mrs. Donovan with the kind of excitement that comes from seeing something familiar in a surprising place. "They are talking about that technology company again," he said, tapping the headline. "Reed Technologies. Apparently their CEO is changing half the business world right now." Several volunteers leaned in with mild curiosity, glancing at the photograph on the front page. The man in the picture stood in a dark tailored coat outside a glass skyscraper, cameras flashing around him while reporters called his name. Lily Brooks looked up briefly from the counter, catching only a quick glimpse of the article before returning to her work. Headlines about powerful business leaders rarely held her attention for long. They felt like stories from a completely different world. Across the room, Alexander Reed remained still for a moment, watching the newspaper being passed between volunteers. He knew that if anyone studied the photograph closely, recognition would come quickly. Yet surprisingly, no one seemed to notice the resemblance between the man in the article and the volunteer wearing a simple apron beside the kitchen counter. The knit cap and casual coat helped, but more than that, it was the setting. No one expected a billionaire chief executive to be standing inside a small outreach kitchen serving soup on a snowy afternoon. Mrs. Donovan gave the newspaper a quick glance before smiling politely. "Well, that is impressive," she said, handing it back. "But right now I am more concerned about tomorrow's food delivery." The volunteers laughed softly, and returned to their cleaning tasks. Lily rinsed another tray and set it on the rack before glancing toward Alexander again. "You look like you have something on your mind," she said casually. Alexander considered his answer for a moment. "Just thinking," he replied. Lily leaned against the counter slightly. "About work?" she asked. Alexander met her eyes and allowed a faint smile. "Something like that." Lily nodded with understanding. "I used to think business people had everything figured out," she said thoughtfully. "But lately I am starting to believe everyone is just trying to solve problems as they go." Alexander listened carefully to her words. It was not the kind of conversation he usually heard in boardrooms or executive meetings. There was no strategy or calculation in her voice, only simple honesty. "You might be right," he said quietly. For a moment neither of them spoke while the final dishes were stacked and the kitchen slowly grew quieter. Outside the windows, the late afternoon sunlight reflected off the remaining snow along the sidewalk. Finally, Mrs. Donovan clapped her hands lightly. "All right, everyone. That is enough work for today," she said warmly. "Thank you again for helping." The volunteers began gathering their coats and bags, preparing to step back into the cold city streets. Lily untied her apron and hung it back on the hook before reaching for her jacket. As she turned toward the door, the young man with the newspaper suddenly paused and looked more closely at the photograph again. His eyes moved from the page to the room and then back to the page once more. Slowly his gaze shifted toward Alexander Reed. Confusion flickered across his face as the realization began forming in his mind. Lily noticed the strange expression and followed his line of sight, unaware that in just a few seconds she would finally understand who the quiet volunteer beside her truly was. The young volunteer holding the newspaper stared at the photograph for another long second before slowly lowering the page and looking directly at Alexander Reed. His eyebrows lifted in disbelief as the pieces began to connect in his mind. "Wait a second," he said quietly, stepping closer. The room was already beginning to empty as other volunteers gathered their coats, but his voice carried just enough curiosity to catch the attention of a few people nearby. He looked again at the photograph and then back at the man standing beside the counter in the simple apron. "That looks exactly like you," he said carefully. The words hung in the warm kitchen air for a moment before anyone responded. Lily Brooks turned her head toward Alexander, confusion flickering across her face as she studied him more closely. The knit cap, the quiet posture, the calm expression. Something about his features suddenly felt familiar in a way she could not explain. The volunteer lifted the newspaper slightly so others could see the front page. "This says Alexander Reed," he continued, his voice filled with growing amazement. "The Chief Executive Officer of Reed Technologies." The room fell quiet in that subtle way spaces do when a surprising truth begins to unfold. Lily glanced from the newspaper to the man beside her, trying to make sense of the moment. Alexander did not immediately answer. Instead, he reached up calmly and removed the knit cap from his head, brushing his dark hair back slightly. Without the hat shadowing his face, the resemblance became unmistakable. The same sharp features, the same thoughtful eyes that appeared in the newspaper photograph. Lily felt her breath pause for a second as recognition slowly settled in. "You are him," she said softly, the realization still forming in her voice. Alexander gave a small nod, not with arrogance, but with the quiet acceptance of someone used to the reaction. "Yes," he replied simply. The volunteer let out a surprised laugh. "You mean the guy serving soup all afternoon is actually a billionaire technology executive?" A few people exchanged stunned glances while Mrs. Donovan placed a hand over her mouth in astonishment. Lily remained still, processing everything she had just learned. Her mind replayed the conversation they had shared only minutes earlier, the casual way he had worked beside everyone else without drawing attention to himself. Suddenly, another memory pushed forward, sharper than the rest. The snowy sidewalk, the man sitting on the bench, the taxi door closing as she handed the driver her last $20. Lily's eyes widened slightly as she looked at him again. "You were the man from yesterday," she said quietly. Alexander's expression softened as he met her gaze. "Yes," he answered. The room seemed to fade into the background as Lily absorbed the truth. The stranger she had helped on a freezing morning was not simply someone down on his luck. He was one of the most powerful business leaders in the country. She shook her head slowly, almost laughing at the strange turn of events. "I had no idea," she admitted. Alexander gave a gentle smile. That was exactly the point. Lily crossed her arms lightly, still trying to understand. So you came here just to watch me volunteer? She asked. Alexander shook his head. I came here because I wanted to see the person who chose kindness when it cost her something important. The quiet sincerity in his voice filled the small kitchen space. For the first time since she missed her interview, Lily felt the strange sense that the events of the past 2 days might be leading somewhere she never expected. For a moment, the kitchen remained quiet, as everyone absorbed the unexpected revelation. The late afternoon light filtered through the frosted windows while the last volunteers slowly gathered their things, leaving Lily Brooks and Alexander Reed standing near the counter. Lily shook her head again with a soft breath of disbelief. So the man I bought a taxi for yesterday was actually a billionaire, she said. Alexander smiled gently, not in pride, but in quiet appreciation of the strange twist of fate. You did not know that at the time, he replied. Which is exactly why it mattered. Lily leaned lightly against the counter, her arms still crossed as she tried to process the situation. Most people would have just said thank you and gone back to their world, she said honestly. Why did you come looking for me? Alexander stepped a little closer, his voice calm and sincere. Because what you did was rare, he said. You helped someone when you believed there was nothing in it for you. Lily let out a small laugh. Well, there definitely was not, she said. I missed my job interview because of it. Alexander nodded slowly. I know. Lily looked up in surprise. You know? Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully unfolded a small piece of paper. It was a printed copy of the security footage from the snowy street, showing Lily standing beside the taxi the previous morning. I asked my team to find you, he explained. That is how I learned about the interview. Lily studied the image for a moment before returning it to him. That seems like a lot of effort for a stranger, she said quietly. Alexander looked at her thoughtfully. Sometimes the smallest decisions reveal the most about a person, he answered. Lily remained silent for a second, unsure how to respond. The truth was she had not thought of the moment on the sidewalk as anything extraordinary. To her it had simply been the right thing to do. Alexander continued speaking, his tone steady and respectful. When Daniel told me you missed the opportunity because you helped me, I realized something important, he said. People like you are exactly the kind of people I want working with me. Lily blinked in surprise. Working with you? She repeated. Alexander nodded. Reed Technologies runs a foundation that supports community programs across the city, he explained. We are expanding several projects this year, and we need someone who understands people the way you do. Lily stared at him for a moment, unsure whether she had heard correctly. Are you offering me a job? She asked. Alexander's smile grew slightly. Yes, he said simply. Not because you helped a billionaire, but because you helped a stranger. Lily glanced around the quiet kitchen, still trying to absorb what was happening. Only 2 days earlier, she had been worried about losing her apartment and wondering if kindness had cost her everything. Now the man standing in front of her was offering a completely unexpected opportunity. What kind of work would it be? She asked cautiously. Alexander answered without hesitation. Helping build programs like this one, he said, gesturing gently around the room. Places that give people a second chance. Lily looked around the outreach kitchen once more, remembering the faces she had served soup to earlier that afternoon. Slowly, a hopeful smile began to form. For the first time since that snowy morning, the future did not feel uncertain. It felt open. Over the next several minutes, the quiet kitchen slowly emptied until only a few volunteers remained finishing the last small tasks of the day. Outside the windows, the winter sky had begun turning soft shades of orange and gray as the sun lowered behind the tall Manhattan buildings. Lily Brooks stood near the counter with her coat folded over her arm, still absorbing the conversation she had just shared with Alexander Reed. Only 2 days earlier, she had been standing in the snow wondering whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life by helping a stranger. Now that same stranger was offering her a chance she had never imagined. Lily finally let out a thoughtful breath and looked up at Alexander again. If I accept, she said carefully, I want it to be because I earned it, not because you feel like you owe me something. Alexander nodded immediately, clearly expecting that answer. That is exactly what I hoped you would say, he replied. The position would begin with a 3-month trial period. You would work with our outreach team to expand programs like this kitchen and several others across the city. If you decide it is not the right path, you are free to leave with my gratitude. Lily considered his words quietly. The offer was generous, but more importantly, it felt meaningful. Helping people had never been part of her career plan before, yet after spending the afternoon inside the outreach center, she could already see how much impact a small effort could create. "All right," she said finally, a hopeful smile beginning to form. "I will try it." Alexander's expression brightened with quiet satisfaction. "Good," he said. He reached into his coat pocket once more and pulled out a small folded bill, carefully smoothing it between his fingers before handing it to her. Lily looked down and immediately recognized the $20 bill she had given the taxi driver on the snowy morning. She stared at it for a moment, surprised that he had kept it. "You saved this?" she asked. Alexander nodded. "It reminded me that sometimes the most valuable investment begins with a simple act of kindness." Lily laughed softly, shaking her head at the strange journey that piece of paper had taken. "You know," she said, slipping the bill carefully into her notebook, "I almost walked past you that morning." Alexander glanced toward the window where the last light of day reflected off the remaining snow along the sidewalk. "But you did not," he replied. For a moment, they both stood quietly, watching the evening settle over the city. Outside, people hurried along the street with scarves wrapped tightly around their necks, while taxis splashed through the melting slush. Life in New York continued moving forward just as it always had. Yet for Lily Brooks, everything felt different now. What had begun as an ordinary winter morning had turned into something she would remember for the rest of her life. As they stepped outside the outreach center together, the cold air met them again, but it no longer felt quite as heavy as before. Lily looked up at the glowing city skyline and smiled to herself, realizing that sometimes the smallest decision on a snowy sidewalk can quietly change the direction of an entire life. On a freezing winter morning in New York City, a struggling young woman rushing to an important job interview makes a life-changing decision when she stops to help a stranger sitting alone in the snow, never imagining that the quiet man she helps is actually a powerful billionaire technology leader. What follows becomes one of those unforgettable millionaire stories where kindness changes everything. As the young woman misses her opportunity, faces the reality of late rent and uncertainty, and begins volunteering at a small community outreach kitchen simply to stay hopeful while searching for work. Meanwhile, the billionaire, deeply moved by the unexpected generosity of someone who believed he was just another stranger in need, quietly investigates the moment that changed his perspective and begins searching for the person who helped him when no one else stopped. When their paths cross again inside a modest soup kitchen, the powerful businessman returns without revealing his identity. Working beside volunteers and observing the genuine compassion of the young woman who never expected anything in return, creating one of the most heartfelt millionaire stories about humility, character, and the rare power of simple human kindness. As the truth slowly unfolds, and the volunteers discover that the quiet helper among them is actually a billionaire CEO, the young woman learns that her small decision on a snowy sidewalk did not cost her everything as she once feared, but instead opened the door to a completely new future. The billionaire leader explains that he searched for her not because she helped a wealthy man, but because she helped someone she believed had nothing to offer, turning their unexpected meeting into one of the most inspiring millionaire stories about integrity and second chances. What begins as a missed interview becomes a powerful reminder that generosity often returns in ways no one can predict, especially when the billionaire offers the young woman an opportunity to help build community programs that support people who need a second chance in life. Through quiet conversations, shared work in the outreach kitchen, and the symbolic return of the $20 bill she once gave away, their journey becomes one of those unforgettable millionaire stories where kindness proves more valuable than wealth, revealing that sometimes the smallest act of compassion can transform two lives at once. In a city that moves fast and rarely stops for strangers, this story shows how a single moment of empathy can shift the path of an ordinary life and even influence the perspective of a powerful billionaire, making it one of the most meaningful millionaire stories about humanity, humility, and hope. As the young woman steps into a new chapter helping others through the Billionaire's Foundation, the lesson remains clear and powerful, reminding viewers why stories like this continue to resonate across generations and why the most memorable millionaire stories are never about money alone, but about the people who choose kindness when it matters most. Character 1. 26-year-old white American woman. Natural light. Winter casual coat and simple sweater. Tired but kind expression. Realistic skin texture. Front-facing portrait. Shoulder-length dark brown hair. Neutral background. Cinematic realism. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Authentic photographic style. Character 2. 38-year-old white American billionaire CEO. Confident calm expression. Well-groomed dark hair. Light stubble. Wearing elegant dark wool coat over tailored suit. Front-facing portrait. Realistic skin texture. Cinematic realism. Professional lighting. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration.